The dust settled slow over Redemption Creek, the way it always did after trouble, lazy and indifferent, as though the land itself had long since stopped caring what happened to the people who scratched their lives into it. The town wasn't much to look at. A general store with a sun, bleached awning, a saloon that smelled of pine resin and old whiskey, a blacksmith who kept his own hours, and a sheriff's office that had sat empty for the better part of 3 months since Sheriff Caldwell took a bullet in the back, and nobody had the courage to pin on a new badge. That was the thing about Redemption Creek. It had earned its name not through any act of grace, but through the kind of silence that follows catastrophe. People here had all run from something. They'd come to be left alone, and in exchange, they left others alone. It was a compact of cowardice dressed up as independence, and it had served the town reasonably well until the Harker brothers rode in. There were 3 of them, Cole, Dutch, and the youngest, a boy named Sable who wasn't yet 20, but who had already seen and done things that had burned all the softness out of him. Cole was the one who gave the orders. Dutch was the one who carried them out without blinking. And Sable was the one everyone watched, because you could never quite tell what was going on behind those pale gray eyes. They'd taken over the saloon first, as men like that always do, and then they'd spread outward like a stain, collecting money from the merchants, helping themselves to supplies, making it known that Redemption Creek was now operating under new management. Nobody had pushed back. Nobody except one person, and that person was the reason everything was about to change. Her name was Marisol Vega, and she ran the only decent boarding house in town, a two-story affair her late mother had built with her own hands out of cedar and stubbornness. Marisol had her mother's stubbornness in abundance. She also had her father's temper, her grandmother's patience, and a particular set of skills she had acquired through 8 years of riding with her uncle's cattle operation across the most unforgiving terrain in the territory. She knew how to rope, brand, raid weather, track, and shoot. She preferred not to shoot, but she knew how. When Cole Harker had come to her door demanding a cut of her boarding house income, she had looked at him for a long moment with dark eyes that gave nothing away, and then she had said, very quietly, that she would sooner burn the building down than give him a single coin. Cole had laughed, because men like Cole always laughed at women who didn't flinch. But he'd also left without the money, and that small fact had lodged in his chest like a splinter he couldn't quite get to. He came back 3 nights later with Dutch and Sable and a lit torch, and they burned the stable behind her boarding house to the ground. She stood in the dirt yard and watched it burn, and she did not cry. The horses had been moved earlier that day. She'd been warned by old Tomaz at the general store, who'd overheard something he shouldn't have. She watched the fire eat the stable she'd helped her mother build board by board when she was 12 years old, and she felt something inside her go very still and very cold, the way water goes still before it freezes solid. She would make this right. She just needed help. The man who arrived in Redemption Creek 2 weeks later came on a gray horse and asked for a room at the boarding house, and he gave his name as Illy Cross. He was tall in the way that mountains are tall, not for the sake of impressing anyone, just as a fact of geography. He had a lean, weathered face, dark hair that needed cutting, and the unhurried movements of a man who had learned that most things in life could be waited out. He wore a single revolver on his left hip, which meant he was either right-handed and unconventional or left-handed and deliberate, and Marisol found herself involuntarily cataloging details about him before she'd even decided whether she liked him. She showed him to the corner room on the 2nd floor, the one with the window facing the street, and she told him the rate and the rules: no fighting inside the house, no liquor in the rooms, meals at 6 and noon, and if he had a horse she'd board it for a modest additional fee. He listened to all of this with the quiet attention of a man who was accustomed to listening to things more dangerous than boarding house rules. And when she was done, he said, "I heard you might be looking for someone." She looked at him. "Who told you that?" "A man in Palo Verde said a woman named Vega had put out a quiet word she needed someone with a particular set of skills, and that she was offering fair compensation." "What kind of skills did you tell him you had?" "The kind that are hard to list politely." He held her gaze steadily. "I've done range work. I've done law work. I've done other things. I'm not a killer for hire. I want to be clear about that." "Then what are you?" He considered this with the gravity of a man being asked something he'd turned over many times. Someone who fixes situations that have gotten past fixing by ordinary means. She studied him for another long moment. He didn't fidget under her scrutiny, which she noted approvingly. Men who fidgeted under her gaze were usually either guilty of something or frightened, and she didn't have use for either kind right now. "The Harker brothers," she said. "I know the name. You know what they did here. I know some of it. Tell me the rest." She told him. She told him about the merchants paying protection, about young Marcus Webb, who'd tried to refuse and had his hand broken for it, about the stable fire, about Sheriff Caldwell's death 3 months ago, which everyone in town believed had the Harkers behind it, though nobody would say so out loud. She told him about the way the town had gone quiet and frightened, the way people had stopped sitting on their porches in the evenings, the way children had stopped playing in the street. She told him all of it in a flat, factual voice, because she'd decided long ago that if she let herself feel it fully, she wouldn't be able to function, and she needed to function. When she was done, Illy Cross sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "What is it you want from me, exactly? I need you to say it plainly." "I want the Harkers gone from this town, by whatever means are necessary, but I want it done without more innocent people getting hurt. That's a constraint that complicates things." "I know. I'm still asking for it." He nodded slowly. "All right, then I'll need to know the town, the layout, the people who can be trusted, who can't. I'll need time to watch and think before I act." "How much time?" "As much as it takes. I don't rush at problems. That's how people get killed." She crossed her arms. "And in the meantime, people keep paying the Harkers and living in fear." "Yes," he said simply, "in the meantime." She didn't like it, but she understood it, and understanding something was usually enough for Marisol to accept it, even when she didn't like it. He stayed. He took his meals at her table, paid his rent on time, and spent his days moving quietly around the town, buying a drink at the saloon here, picking up supplies at the general store there, playing cards with the off-shift miners who came in from the Ridge operation on weekends. He was good at being unremarkable. It was clearly a practiced skill. He never drew attention, never provoked, never let anyone see him watching even when he was watching everything. But he talked to Marisol in the evenings, after the other boarders had retired. Sitting on the back porch she'd built to replace the burned stable yard as a place to breathe evening air. He asked questions that were precise and thoughtful, and she found herself answering with a frankness that surprised her. She was not, by nature, a woman who spoke freely to people she didn't know. She'd learned early that showing what mattered to you gave others leverage over you. But there was something about the quality of his attention that made her less guarded than usual. He listened as though what she said genuinely mattered, not as preamble to his own talking, but as something he was carefully filing away for safekeeping. She learned things about him in return, though he shared them the way a man offers food he's not sure will be accepted carefully, watching her reaction. He had grown up in Texas, the son of a rancher. He had ridden as a deputy marshal for 4 years before leaving the service after a trial he'd believed in ended wrong. He didn't elaborate on what wrong meant, and she didn't press, because she recognized the shape of a wound that wasn't ready to be looked at yet. He had spent the subsequent years doing exactly what he'd described to her, moving from place to place, solving problems that had gotten past ordinary fixing. "Do you have somewhere that's home?" she asked him one evening when the stars were out and the desert was making its nighttime sounds. He looked at the sky for a while before answering, "Not right now." "Does that bother you?" "It used to," he said. "Less so recently." She didn't ask what had changed recently. She thought she might already know, and the knowing of it made something shift unsteadily in the center of her chest. The situation with the Harkers came to a head sooner than Illy had wanted, because Sable Harker decided to take an interest in Marisol. It started as looks, that particular kind of assessment that made a woman's skin feel like a target. Then it became comments when she was in the saloon delivering the weekly bread order she'd supplied to them since before the Harkers arrived. Comments that were constructed to humiliate as much as to flatter, designed to reduce. Marisol endured them with a stillness that impressed even Illy, who watched from across the room with his jaw set and his hand loose at his side. But the evening Sable came to the boarding house and presented himself at her door with a bottle of whiskey and an expectation that was clear in every line of his posture. That was the evening. Things escalated beyond looks and comments. Marisol opened the door and looked at him. "I thought you and I could get better acquainted," Sable said, with the lazy smile of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. "I'm not interested," she said. "Good night." She moved to close the door. He put his boot in it. She looked down at his boot and then back up at him, and the look on her face was not fear. It was the specific expression of a woman recalibrating how much trouble she was willing to accept before she did something about it. "Sable," the voice came from the hallway behind her. Illy had come down from his room. He stood there in the lamplight, fully dressed, unhurried, his left hand hanging loose at his side. "Stay out of this, stranger," Sable said, but his eyes had shifted, and there was a new quality in them, a calculation. She said good night. Illy said, "I think that's the end of the conversation." Sable looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Marisol. Then he smiled a different kind of smile, the kind that promises a later reckoning, and pulled his boot back from the door. "Another time, then," he said to both of them. When he'd gone, Marisol let out a slow breath and turned to find Illy watching her with that careful expression he had. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "No," he agreed, "you were handling it." "Then why did you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I didn't want you to have to." There was a difference, she thought, between not wanting someone to have to handle something alone and not trusting them to handle it. Illy had always understood that difference, which was part of why she'd come to trust him in a way she hadn't expected. "He'll tell his brothers," she said. "Yes. This will move faster now." "Yes," he said again. "I was ready to move faster anyway. I know enough now." He looked at her steadily. "Trust me." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I do. That's what worries me." He almost smiled at that. It rearranged his face in a way she found she liked considerably. What Illy had spent his weeks quietly assembling was not a fighting force. He had no illusions about Redemption Creek producing gunfighters on demand. What he had assembled was a set of conditions. He had spoken privately with 7 men in town, men he'd assessed carefully, the blacksmith, 2 miners, the doctor, old Tamaz, and 2 ranchers who drove cattle through town monthly and had lost significant income to Harker taxes. He had mapped the saloon, the Harker brothers' movements, the timing of their routines. He had sent a letter to a federal marshal he'd once ridden with, a man named Prout, who operated out of the territory capital and who Illy knew to be honest. The letter had gone out 3 weeks prior, and a reply had come 2 days ago. Marshal Prout was coming. He would be in Redemption Creek within the week. But the Harkers couldn't know that, and they couldn't be allowed to run before he arrived. What Illy needed was to keep the situation contained and controlled until Prout got there, while making sure the Harkers' escalating aggression didn't hurt anyone in the meantime. It was a plan that had the virtue of being legal, mostly non-violent, and likely to produce a lasting result rather than just a body count. It had the disadvantage of requiring things to hold together for several more days after Sable's visit, which had just complicated the timeline considerably. He told Marisol all of this on the back porch late that night and watched her take it in. "You've been working this the whole time," she said. "Yes, you could have told me. I wasn't sure the letter would get a response. I didn't want to give you hope that didn't pan out." She was quiet, turning this over. Then she said, "What do we do until Prout arrives?" "You keep your normal routines. Don't give the Harkers any reason to think anything has changed. I'll manage Sable, make sure he knows coming back here isn't worth his while without making it a direct confrontation. And if he pushes it anyway." Illy's expression was quiet and serious. "Then I'll deal with it." She believed him. That was the problem and the relief simultaneously. She believed him completely. And somewhere in the weeks of evening conversations and careful questions and that single moment in the doorway, she had stopped thinking of Illy Cross as a hired solution to a problem, and started thinking of him as something she didn't quite have a word for yet. She didn't have time to examine that right now. She pushed it aside the way she pushed aside most things that were important but not urgent, and she focused on getting through the next several days intact. Sable did come back, not alone but with Dutch, which was a more serious proposition. They came in the afternoon when the street was busiest, which was clever. It meant a public confrontation, the kind that would demonstrate to the whole town exactly who held power in Redemption Creek. Cole had sent them, Marisol suspected. Cole, who had never forgotten that she'd told him she'd burn the place down before she'd give him money, and who had now acquired a more personal reason for wanting to make an example of her. They pushed into the boarding house common room and found it occupied by Marisol, old Tomas, who was having his afternoon coffee, and Illy, who was sitting at the corner table reading a newspaper with every appearance of contentment. Dutch said, "You newspaper, get out." Illy turned a page. "I'm a paying guest. This is a common room." Dutch's eyes narrowed. He was not accustomed to being ignored. He was not entirely sure what to do with it, which bought a critical few seconds. Sable, meanwhile, was looking at Marisol with that promising, reckoning smile. "Cole wants to talk to you, directly, tonight at the saloon." "Tell Cole I'm busy," Marisol said. "That wasn't a request. I know what it wasn't." She held his gaze without blinking. "Tell Cole that if he wants to talk to me, he can come here in the daylight and talk, like a man instead of a coward hiding behind his brothers." Sable's smile disappeared. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. "You," he said, pointing at her, "are going to regret saying that." "Possibly," she said, "but not as much as you're going to regret the next few days. I promise you that." It was a strange thing to say, and Sable clearly didn't know what to do with it. He looked at Illy, who had still not looked up from his newspaper. He looked at Dutch. He looked back at Marisol. Then he turned and walked out, Dutch at his heels. The room was quiet for a moment. Old Tomas let out a breath that he appeared to have been holding for some time. Illy folded his newspaper. "That was more provocative than I'd have chosen." He said, "I know," she said, "but I am so tired of being managed carefully." She looked at him, and there was a brightness in her eyes that was not quite anger and not quite something else. "How many more days?" "2, maybe 3. She nodded. "Then I'll manage carefully for 2 more days." Those 2 days were the longest of her adult life. Cole Harker came to the boarding house, as she'd predicted he would, because she'd correctly understood that his ego would not allow him to be summoned and then told to come by daylight like a normal person. He came alone, which surprised her, and then didn't. Cole was smart in the way predators are smart, and he had understood that showing up with his brothers would look like what it was. He sat in her common room and looked at her with flat, measuring eyes, and he said he wanted to make her an offer. He said he was a businessman, that he understood she was a woman who valued independence, that he could respect that, and that he thought there was a way they could arrange something that worked for both of them. She listened to all of this and thought about her mother building this house board by board, and about the stable burning, and about Marcus Webb's broken hand, and about Sable's boot in her door. She thought about the 7 men Illy had quietly spoken to, and about a federal marshal riding toward Redemption Creek from the territory capital. She thought about the particular quality of the evenings on the back porch, and about a man who had said he didn't want her to have to handle things alone. And she told Cole Harker that she would think about his offer. She would not, but she needed him to believe she might, for 2 more days. Cole left looking satisfied, which made her feel slightly sick. But she had learned long ago that sometimes the necessary thing and the comfortable thing were entirely different propositions. Marshal Prout arrived on a Thursday morning, which Illy had predicted within half a day. He came with 2 deputies, quietly and without announcement, riding into town from the south in the early light before the saloon was open. He went directly to the boarding house, where Illy was waiting, and the 2 men clasped hands with the ease of people who have been through difficult things together and come out the other side. What followed was methodical and, for the most part, not violent. Prout had warrants for Cole and Dutch Harker, on charges from 3 other towns that predated Redemption Creek. Sable had no outstanding warrants, which was both surprising and not. The youngest of them had always been careful to let his brothers carry the legal exposure while he operated in the space behind it. Cole and Dutch were taken from the saloon in the late morning, Cole with dignity and Dutch with the kind of resistance that resulted in a bruised face and a more secure set of restraints. Cole looked at Illy across the distance between them with the expression of a man filing something away for later, but Illy held his gaze steadily, and there was nothing in his face that invited further consideration of the matter. Sable was the complication, as Illy had suspected he would be. He was not in the saloon when the Harkers were taken. He had been watching from an alley, it later became clear, and when he saw what was happening, he made the calculation of a survivor rather than a loyal brother, and disappeared into the back streets with a horse and a head start that could have carried him clean out of the territory. Instead, he rode to the boarding house. Marisol was there alone. Illy was at the saloon with Prout, concluding the official business of the situation. Sable came through the back, because he'd noted the lay, out during his previous visit, and he came into the kitchen where she was making coffee with the flat gray eyes of a man who had decided that if he was going to lose everything else, he was going to take this one thing. He was very fast, and she was very good, and the 2 facts met somewhere in the middle of the kitchen in a struggle that lasted approximately 45 seconds and ended with a cast iron skillet and a decision on Marisol's part that she made without hesitation. Sable Harker sat on the kitchen floor holding his head, dazed and disarmed, when Illy came through the back door with his revolver drawn and found the situation already resolved. He looked at Sable on the floor. He looked at Marisol standing over him with the skillet and a deliberate expression. He looked at Sable again. "You all right?" he asked her, completely. She said, "Right." He moved to restrain Sable, who offered no further resistance, and then went to the door to call for one of Prout's deputies. When the deputy had taken Sable away, there would be charges for the stable fire, as it turned out, because old Tamaz had seen everything and was no longer afraid to say so. Illy came back into the kitchen and stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the room and then at her. "That was well done," he said. "The skillet or the last 2 days?" "Both." She set the skillet down on the stove and turned to face him, and she was very tired suddenly, the way you get tired when something that has been holding you rigid for months finally releases. She was also, she realized, not as alone in this moment as she had expected to be. She had expected, once the situation was resolved, to feel the particular loneliness of the aftermath, the way you pay for necessary hardness with a period of emptiness. She did not feel that. She felt instead the presence of the man standing in her kitchen with his hands in his pockets and a quiet expression on his face. And she felt something else that she had been carefully not thinking about for several weeks. "What do you do now?" she asked him. "Well," he said, "I was thinking I'd stay for a while." She looked at him. "This situation is fixed." "Yes," he said, "I know." The word she hadn't had available for several weeks settled into place with a gentle clarity. She thought, "Oh." And then she crossed the kitchen, which was only 4 steps, and she looked up at him from a distance of about 18 inches, and she said, "You should know that I'm not a simple woman. I don't do things simply." "I noticed that," he said. "I like it. I'm also not someone who changes easily. If something matters to me, it matters for a long time." "I noticed that too," he said, and his voice was a little different now, quieter and more careful, the way he sounded when something was genuinely important to him. "All right," she said, and she stepped forward that last distance and kissed him, and it was not a simple thing at all. He had been very still for a moment, the way he was still when he was taking in something important. And then he was not still at all. One of his hands came up to the side of her face with a gentleness that was completely at odds with the previous 45 minutes of the morning, and she thought distantly that she had correctly identified the quality that made him exceptional at what he did. He paid attention. He was present. Every nerve he had was focused on exactly what was happening right now, and right now he was kissing her as though this were the most important task he'd been set in a considerable period of time. She had kissed men before. She had not been kissed like this before. There was a difference between kissing and being met, and she was being met precisely and completely, and the floor was a little uncertain under her feet afterward. She pulled back and looked at him. He looked back. There was a color in his face that hadn't been there before, and a quality in his eyes that she recognized because she felt it herself